In 1988 at Charlotte Street, Kansas City, 22-year-old Christopher Bryson was discovered nude and severely beaten. Wearing nothing but a dog collar, he was stumbling down Charlotte Street shouting for help. A meter reader found Bryson and called the police, who arrived minutes later. But what they heard from Bryson sent chills down their spine, and little did they know that they would come across a man so sadistic, which would question the length of depravity humans can go to. Welcome to Twisted Logic, and today we are going to talk about a man that wreaked havoc in the Kansas City between 1984 to 1987. The man in question, Robert Andrew Berdella Jr., infamously known as the Kansas City Butcher. Robert Berdella was born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, the first of two sons born to Robert Andrew Berdella Sr. and Mary Louise. As a child, Robert was intelligent, but a loner who rarely played outside his home and seldom had friends visit to socialize. Robert was largely unathletic, whereas his younger brother Daniel displayed an aptitude for sports from an early age. Robert's father valued sports and physical education and viewed his older son's lack of interest in sports as a sign of failure, often comparing him unfavorably with his younger brother. Occasionally, Robert's father physically and emotionally abused his children, such as by beating them with a leather strap, something that would shape the young Robert's future. Robert was the center of abuse and bullying, not only in home, but also in school. Despite performing well academically, he seldom socialized with his peers. When Robert reached puberty, he discovered that he was homosexual. Initially, he kept this fact a closely guarded secret, and he did not become open about his sexuality for several years. By his mid-teens, Robert had begun to display a degree of aggression, becoming rude and condescending to others, particularly women. On Christmas Day 1965, the Robert family drove to Canton, Ohio to visit relatives. That evening, Robert's father had a heart attack at the age of 39. 2 days later, Robert returned to Cuyahoga Falls by himself. When he arrived home, his family told him his father had died. Robert sought solace in his Catholicism, reading extensively about many faiths. He eventually became cynical about all religions. In 1965, Robert saw the film adaptation of the John Fowles novel, The Collector. The plot of the film revolves around a disturbed man who stalks and then abducts a young woman whom he finds attractive, holding her captive in his windowless stone basement. This movie would go on to form a lasting impression on him. Shortly after the death of Robert's father, his mother remarried, an action that was met with resentment by Robert, who viewed it as a form of betrayal against his father. As a result, he became increasingly withdrawn and further immersed himself in the solitary activities he had participated in since childhood, such as painting, collecting coins and stamps, and writing to foreign pen pals. In the summer of 1967, Robert graduated from Cuyahoga Falls High School. Throughout his studies in high school, he had earned such excellent grades and showed such potential that in 1966, one teacher had placed him in an independent study program. Shortly after graduation, Robert relocated to Kansas City, enrolling in the Kansas City Art Institute, with aspirations of becoming a college professor. In his first year at the institute, Robert was considered an attentive and talented student, although by his second year, he became vocally anti-authoritarian, becoming acquainted with a clique of students who supplied him with drugs, which he then sold to other students at a profit. In addition, he began regularly abusing alcohol. He also engaged in acts of animal torture on at least 2 occasions. During one of these instances, he decapitated a duck in the presence of his peers, and in the second, he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. At the age of 19, Robert was arrested for attempting to sell methamphetamine to an undercover officer. He was released after posting a $3,000 bond. He would later plead guilty to the offense and was handed a 5-year suspended sentence. 1 month after this first arrest, Robert and 2 other students were arrested for possession of marijuana and LSD in Johnson County. In 1969, Robert voluntarily withdrew from the institute after receiving harsh criticism from college administrators for killing and cooking a duck for the sake of art. He chose to remain in Kansas City, and in September of that year, he moved into an address within the Hyde Park district, 4315 Charlotte Street. By this stage, Berdella had been openly gay for several years. He began spending much of his free time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, petty criminals, and runaways. Robert would typically befriend these individuals, then try to help free them from their drug addictions or criminal lifestyles. Though he was adamant that, throughout much of the 1970s, he had no physical contact whatsoever with any of them. In 1982, Robert began renting his own booth at the Westport Flea Market. This store was named Bob's Bizarre Bazaar and primarily sold and traded primitive art, jewelry, and antiques. At the flea market, Robert became acquainted with a fellow merchant named Paul Howell, who operated a booth adjacent to his own. Soon, Robert became acquainted with Paul Howell's younger son, Jerry. Initially, Jerry Howell and his friends taunted Robert for his overt homosexuality, although, according to Robert, Jerry Howell later confided to him that he and his friends occasionally earned money as male prostitutes. By the early 1980s, Paul Howell had relocated his business to a store close to the intersection of 39th and Main Street, with his family living in an apartment above the shop. Robert remained a casual friend of the family, offering his assistance if Jerry encountered any minor scrapes with the law. With time, Robert and Jerry became close companions, but everything changed on the 5th of July, 1985. Jerry Howell, now 19 years old, was promised by Robert to drive the youth to attend a dancing contest. While in the car, both Robert and Jerry consumed alcohol, diazepam, and acepromazine. Robert then drove Jerry to his house, who was already unconscious. He then injected Jerry with a heavy tranquilizer before binding him to his bed. Robert then repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated Jerry with foreign objects, which ultimately resulted in his death. Robert then dragged his body to the basement. He suspended Jerry's body above a large cooking pot and made several incisions to his inner elbows and jugular vein, leaving the body suspended in this position overnight to allow the blood to drain from his corpse. The following day, he dismembered Jerry's body using a chainsaw and boning knives and wrapped the sections in newspaper and trash bags. These bags were later placed inside larger trash bags, which Robert placed outside for a garbage crew to collect and take to a landfill site. When later questioned by officers investigating Jerry's disappearance, Robert claimed to have driven the youth to the dance competition as promised, where the two had parted company close to Jerry's intended destination. Robert further claimed he had not seen him since, but this was just the beginning of chaos that Robert would cast over the Kansas City. On April 10, 1985, an itinerant former lodger, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, arrived on Robert's doorstep, asking if he could stay at his house for a short time. Although Sheldon paid his rent responsibly, Robert considered him to be an inconvenience. Although he was not physically attracted to Sheldon, on April 12th, he drugged and held Sheldon captive because he returned home from work to find Sheldon intoxicated. Sheldon was drugged with sedatives and held captive in the second-floor bedroom for 3 days, enduring forms of torture such as the swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye, the insertion of needles beneath his fingertips, the binding of his wrists with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. 3 days after Robert had begun holding Sheldon captive, on April 15th, a workman came to perform some scheduled work on the roof of his home, leading Robert to fatally suffocate Sheldon by placing a sack over his head, which he then tightened with a piece of rope. He later dissected Sheldon's body in the third-floor bathroom. The following June, Berdella found Mark Wallace hiding in his tool shed to seek shelter from a severe thunderstorm. As had been the case with Robert Sheldon, Berdella invited him inside his house, and noting Wallace's acute state of tenseness and depression, volunteered to inject him with chlorpromazine with the explanation this would calm down and relax him. Wallace willingly accepted the offer, and 30 minutes later, Berdella decided to render him captive. Wallace was carried to the second-floor bedroom, where he endured almost a day of captivity and torture, including the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks to his body at any point at which Wallace began regressing into a state of unconsciousness. According to Berdella, 1 hour after his experimenting with hypodermic needles by inserting them into various muscles upon his victim's back. Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. On September 26, 1985, Berdella answered a phone call from an acquaintance named James Ferris, who asked to stay at Berdella's home for a short time. Berdella agreed, with the intention of kidnapping Ferris, whom he arranged to meet at a bar that evening. Despite the brutality to which he had subjected his first three victims, Berdella claimed that Ferris was the first victim upon whom he intentionally inflicted torture. He also informed investigators that there were occasions during his final three victims' periods of captivity when he ceased making additions to his abuse logs because he assumed the victim would not be able to make it much longer. Berdella brought Ferris home and drugged him with crushed tranquilizers concealed in a meal, then tied him to his bed before torturing him almost constantly for approximately 27 hours. The torture included the repeated administration of 7,700-volt electrical shocks to the shoulder and testicles for up to 5 minutes in each instance, and acupuncture via hypodermic needles to the neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious, but Berdella continued his physical and sexual assaults until he noted in his log that Ferris was unable to sit up more than 10 to 15 seconds. The next entry read, "very delayed breathing," and finally Berdella noted that Ferris died with a slang term he had used in his career as a chef, 86, which Berdella later explained meant anything from throw it out to stop the project. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old drug addict and occasional prostitute who, with his wife, had twice lived briefly at Berdella's house in 1984. After Stoops and his wife moved out of Berdella's home the second time, Berdella did not see him again until a chance encounter at Kansas City's Liberty Memorial Park on June 17, 1986. Berdella invited him to his house with an offer of lunch, with an added incentive of sex, as Stoops stated he needed $13 to purchase drugs. Berdella would later stress to investigators he had been extremely physically attracted to Stoops, and this victim was held captive for 2 weeks before he died. He gradually increased Stoops' terror, attempting to make him a cooperative and incapacitated sex slave. Berdella used electrical shocks through Stoops' closed eyes in an attempt to blind him, and injected drain cleaner into his larynx to try to silence his screaming. During the second week of his capture, Stoops asked Berdella for a soft drink and sandwich. When Berdella refused, Stoops burst into tears. On June 27, he ruptured Stoops' anal wall with his fist, causing bleeding and discharge. Towards the end of Stoops' captivity, he tried to feed his captive ice cream and soup, although Stoops wasn't able to keep anything down. By the final day of his captivity, Stoops was so weak, Berdella later stated he had been unable to breathe in a sitting position. On July 1, 1986, Stoops died. A forensic pathologist later testified that the ruptured anal wall caused septic shock, which proved fatal. In the spring of 1987, Berdella became friendly with 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson. This casual friendship began when Pearson entered his shop and explained to Berdella that, as a child, he had held an interest in both witchcraft and wizardry. Shortly thereafter, Pearson temporarily lodged with Berdella and willingly performed chores around his home as a means of paying rent. According to Berdella, he did not initially intend to capture Pearson, but began forming the plan to do so on June 23rd, 2 weeks after having bailed Pearson out of jail. On the afternoon of June 23rd, Berdella and Pearson watched the movie Creepshow, two together before eating lunch. As the two drove around Kansas, the young man began jokingly referring to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. This disclosure finalized Berdella's decision to hold Pearson captive. That evening, Berdella ensured Pearson became intoxicated before injecting him with chlorpromazine and moving him down to his basement, where he bound Pearson's hands above his head, then linked the rope he had used for this purpose to a brick column before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. He then brought an electrical transformer to the basement. According to Berdella, Pearson was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. On the 5th day of his captivity, having by this stage endured torture such as the repeated administration of electrical shocks with a transformer and the breaking of several hand bones with an iron rod to render him submissive, Burdella deduced Pearson had earned his trust as to his continued cooperation in his sexual and physical abuse. As a form of reward, Pearson was moved to the second floor, with Burdella first informing Pearson that if he continued to cooperate, he would not continue to inflict as much pain upon him as he had done so while he had been held captive in the basement. Throughout the latter part of his 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson trained himself to sleep without moving so that he did not antagonize Burdella and thus invite further torture or return to the basement. After 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson deeply bit into Burdella's penis before screaming he could not continue to tolerate his ongoing poor treatment. In response, Burdella killed Pearson by first bludgeoning him into unconsciousness with a tree limb, then suffocating him with a bag and ligature, before driving to the hospital to receive treatment for his wound. Pearson's body was later dismembered in the basement, and his head initially stored in a plastic bag inside Burdella's freezer before being buried in the backyard. At 1 a.m. on March 29, 1988, Burdella abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson, whom he lured to his house upon the promise of payment for sex. At Burdella's home, Bryson was knocked unconscious with an iron bar, then bound to Burdella's bed, where he was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture endured by previous victims. Although in Bryson's case, Burdella repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia, before exclaiming to him, "The only things you need to think about are you, me, and this house." After several days, Burdella explained to Bryson that he had begun to trust his captive, and that although he was willing to discuss some aspects of the abuse and torture he was receiving, there would be no negotiations regarding his sexual abuse. Burdella finished this discussion with a stern warning. "I've gotten this far with other people before, and they're dead now because of mistakes they made." By the third day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Burdella to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after his sexual abuse, rather than to the bed above his head, upon the excuse that his doing so was restricting the circulation to his arms. He had also persuaded Burdella to leave a television on in the room with the remote control placed between his legs whenever Burdella was out of the room. Bryson later stated to investigators that he thought almost constantly about escaping. The following day, he managed to break free of his restraints by burning through them using a book of matches Burdella had inadvertently left in the room and within his reach when he had left the house to go to work. Wearing nothing but a dog collar, Bryson managed to escape from the house by jumping from a second-floor window, breaking a bone in his foot. He ran toward a meter reader who was walking down the other side of the street, shouting for him to call the police. Questioned at the scene by 4 officers, Bryson initially claimed he had been hitchhiking when abducted by Burdella, who had kidnapped, raped, and tortured him for 4 days before he escaped by jumping from a window on the second floor of the property. Burdella had kept him bound to a bed on the second floor of the house throughout much of the time, repeatedly sodomizing him, drugging him, and injecting his throat with drain cleaner to diminish his ability to speak loudly. As Bryson spoke, the officers also noted that in addition to the dog collar and broken foot, Bryson had red, swollen eyes, invisible scars, and welts across his entire body. 2 officers were told to maintain discreet surveillance of the property. Bryson was driven to the Menorah Medical Center for treatment, accompanied by a 3rd officer, while the 4th officer radioed the Kansas City Police Department to request a formal search warrant of the property. During later questioning at the KCPD, Bryson divulged that his captor had shown him Polaroid images of men who appeared to be deceased, and that he was told that he would never leave the property, and that if he became a nuisance or threat, he would either be subjected to greater levels of torture than what he had already endured, or simply be killed. On the afternoon of Bryson's escape, Burdella was arrested on charges pertaining to the sexual assault of Christopher Bryson. He declined to allow officers inside his home, and the search warrant earlier requested was drafted to search his property. Corroborating Bryson's claims of having been restrained and tortured in a second-floor bedroom, investigators discovered the bedroom on the second floor had burnt ropes attached to the posts at the foot of the bed. Also in the room was an electrical transformer plugged into a wall with wires leading to the bed. A metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs, and eye drops were also close to the bed. Also found in the room were a long iron pipe, various lengths of rope, and leather belts. Investigators also noted that posts on the bed had been extensively worn, suggesting that restraints had earlier been tied to them, and that the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves. Searching the house and grounds of 4315 Charlotte Street, investigators uncovered a human skull inside a closet on the second floor of his property and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. The search also uncovered several human vertebrae scarred by both hacksaw and knife marks, stowed in a hallway, and several human teeth stowed in 2 envelopes. Both a hacksaw and a miter saw were discovered in the basement of the property, and a chainsaw was also found to be soiled with bloodstains, flesh, and pubic hairs. Luminol tests revealed that the floor of Berdella's basement and 2 plastic trash barrels were extensively bloodstained. 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various men were also found in Berdella's house. These pictures showed Christopher Bryson and several other men both in life and in death. Many of the images had been taken while the subjects were being tortured. The search also uncovered numerous restraints and sexual devices, pornographic literature, hypodermic needles, and a book on narcotics. Officers also discovered a stenographer's pad containing detailed torture logs that Berdella had maintained for each victim lying atop a chest of drawers. Several newspaper clippings from the Kansas City Star mentioning a missing young man named Jerry Howell and a wallet and driver's license belonging to a missing person named James Ferris were discovered in a closet on the second floor of the property. Berdella provided testimony to prosecutors between December 13th and 15th, after he changed his plea and sought approval of their agreement not to seek the death penalty against him if he fully confessed. In this testimony, Berdella claimed the movie he had first seen in 1965, The Collector, had left a major impression on him. Following the senses of shock and disgust he claimed to have initially experienced after killing his first victim, the movie had resurfaced in his memory and subsequently became a motivating psychological force in the actions he exhibited against his victims in his subsequent murders. His victims, he stated to investigators, had lost any degree of humanity in his eyes once he had chosen to render them captive. In 1992, Berdella contacted Reverend Roger Coleman, whom he had met when first incarcerated, relaying his distress that the staff at the Missouri State Penitentiary were withholding his heart medication. At 2 p.m. on October 8, 1992, Berdella complained to prison staff of severe heart pains and was taken from his cell to the prison infirmary. Medical staff determined his heart was unstable and called an ambulance. Berdella was taken to a hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where he was pronounced dead from a heart attack at 3:55 p.m. He was 43 years old. By the time of Berdella's arrest, he had abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men. Although more than 20 different men were depicted in postures suggesting unconsciousness or death within the 334 Polaroid images and 34 snapshot prints seized from 4315 Charlotte Street following his arrest, Berdella was adamant that the 6 men identified as victims and whom he had confessed to killing were the only ones that he murdered.
What else about newspaper coverage, since that has been your access to the media, has bothered you? Other than perhaps things like the call for your execution?
Well, the media have from the beginning took the evidence as the police gave it to them or reinterpreted it themselves and basically tried me and found me guilty from the beginning of crimes of the most horrendous nature and put it in the most horrendous light.
You think they were too graphic, too sensational?
Well, I'm in no way try to distract from the crimes that I am guilty of. I have gone to court and taken responsibility for that. I would point out to the public and to the media that basically they are portraying me as being non-human, and their motivation is no separate from the way I treated my victims. I treated them as something less than human. It's nothing more than a play toy or a play object. This is what the media has done to me. It's dehumanized me.